Welcome to Chapter by Chapter, an ASMR channel where I'll be reading chapters from different books. One chapter a book, unless of course they're copyright free. I'm going to start this off with my very first chapter from one of my favourite books. So this is The 13 and a Half Lives of Captain Bluebear, novel by Walter Moers. A great fantasy book in a series by Walter Moers that I can highly, highly recommend. The very first chapter is my life as a mini pirate. People usually start life by being born, not me though. That's to say, I don't know how I came into the world. Purely theoretically, I could have emerged from the foam on a crest of a wave, or developed inside a seashell like a pearl. Then again, I might have fallen from the sky like a shooting star. The only certainty is that I was a foundling, abandoned in the middle of the ocean. My earliest memory is of being afloat in rough seas, naked and alone in a walnut shell, for at first I was very, very small. I also remembered a sound, a very big sound. When you're little you tend to overestimate the size of things, but I now know that it was really the biggest sound in the world. Its source was the loudest, most monstrous and dangerous whirlpool anywhere in the seven seas. I had no idea, of course, that my little nutshell was bobbing toward it, the dreaded maelstrom. To me it was just a gigantic gurgling sound. I probably thought, if I thought at all at that stage, that it was the most natural thing in the world to lie naked in a nutshell and drift across the open sea towards the origin of that deafening roar. The sound grew louder and louder, and the nutshell bobbed more and more violently. But I was equally unaware, of course, that I had long been in the grip of the whirlpool. My tiny boat, probably the smallest in the world, went dancing towards the roaring abyss in a miles-long spiral. It should be borne in mind that this was just about the most hopeless predicament in which anyone at sea could find himself. Any mariner in his senses gave the maelstrom the widest possible berth, and even if someone had come to my rescue, he would have suffered the same fate. He would have been sucked down with me to the bed of the ocean, for no vessel could withstand the pull of the whirlpool. My nutshell now began to rotate on its own axis, dancing to perdition in waltz time as it descended into the ocean's gurgling maw. As for me, I merely watched the stars spinning around overhead and listened entranced to the maelstrom, quite free from any forebodings. And that was when I first heard one of the mini pirates' weird songs. The mini pirates were the masters of the Zamonian Sea. Nobody knew this, however, because they were too small to be noticed. No wave was too high, no storm too tempestuous, and no whirlpool too powerful for them not to defy it. The most audacious of all seafarers, they were forever seeking opportunities to demonstrate their nautical skills, even when confronted by the most potent of natural forces. Thanks to their exceptional seaman-like abilities, they alone were capable of tackling the maelstrom. And that was how they ended up in the whirlpool, out of pure bravado, bawling their defiant pirate songs. The masthead lookout, carefully scanning the surface for the most favourable currents and wave tunnels, had sighted me through his tiny telescope, just as I was about to be engulfed by the maelstrom. I was doubly fortunate to be found by the mini pirates, of all people, because anyone of normal size would probably have failed to spot me. They hauled me aboard, wrapped me up in oilskins and lashed me to the mast with thick ropes, a safety measure that puzzled me exceedingly at the time. Meantime, they continued to wage their heroic battle with the elements as a matter of course, scampering up and down the mast like squirrels, hoisting and reefing sails at a rate that made me dizzy just to watch. As one man, they offset the motion of the pitching, tossing vessel by hurling themselves to port or starboard, forward or aft. They manned the pumps or vanished into the bows of the ship and reappeared with brimming buckets, leapt through hatchways, swung to and fro on the halyards. In constant motion they wrestled with the ship's wheel, bellowed at each other, hauled on ropes, joined forces to hoist the mainsail in double quick time, and never for one moment forgot to sing their pirate sea shanties. I even recall that one of them persisted in scrubbing the deck throughout this pandemonium. Deluged with spray, the ship, over on a side, rid skywards and was actually submerged more than once, but she didn't sink. I swallowed some seawater for the first time, and I'm bound to say it didn't taste too bad. We glided through wave tunnels, rode mighty mountains of foam, were tossed high into the air and carried down into the depths. The ship was hurled to and fro, buffeted, jostled, and spat on by gigantic billows, but the mini-pirates were undaunted. They yelled at the sea, spat back at it, and defiantly jabbed the waves with their grappling hooks. They fanned out amongst the masts at lightning speed, reefed sails and unfurled them a moment later. They reacted to every quirk of the sea, every puff of the wind and movement of the ship, and knew at once what had to be done next. No one gave any orders, all were of equal rank. Thanks to their joint endeavours, they finally overcame the mighty ocean, while I myself, securely lashed to the mast, watched their activities with the utmost amazement. If you're as small as a mini-pirate, as small as I was too at the time, you live in another time dimension. Anyone who has ever tried to capture a fly in his hand will know that the tiny creature is far superior in terms of speed and agility. We operate in slow motion from the fly's point of view, so it can easily outmaneuver and evade us. It was the same with the mini-pirates. To them, what the crew of a ship of a normal size would regard as a raging whirlpool seemed a mere eddy. Every huge billow consisted of many wavelets through which they could navigate with ease. Just as a hurricane could sweep across a city and topple the tallest buildings, but leave a little spider's web intact, so the monstrous whirlpool could not harm us. We were protected by a diminutive size. So we escaped from the deadly maelstrom. I was unaware of its true dangers. As I have said, they didn't dawn on me until much later. All I noticed was that gurgling sound steadily faded, and the mini-pirates' activities became less frantic. The situation eventually eased so much that they could gather around, and tie my rope, and gaze at me in wonderment. I gazed back at them. Mini-pirates, as their name implies, were pretty small. A mini-pirate 6 inches tall was considered a giant by his own kind. The little creature sailed the seas in tiny ships, ever on the lookout for something small enough to capture. This happened very seldom, never in fact. Truth to tell, the mini-pirates had never managed to capture a single prize, not even a rowing boat, in the whole history of navigation. Sometimes, usually in desperation, they attacked bigger ships, even ocean-going giants, but their efforts passed unnoticed as a rule. The tiny buccaneers hurled their grappling hooks at the big vessels and were towed along until they gave up. Either that, or they fired their dinky little cannon, but the cannonballs always fell short and splashed harmlessly into the sea after travelling only a few yards. Because they never captured any booty, the mini-pirates lived mainly on seaweed or such fish as they were capable of tackling, sardines for instance, or very small scampi. They didn't turn up their noses at plankton either if times were hard. The mini-pirates had little iron hooks instead of hands, and wooden stumps instead of proper legs. Nor did I ever see one without an eye patch. At first I thought they had been wounded during their reckless attempts to board a prize, but later I learned they were born this way, complete with hats and moustaches. And there's an insert here from the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs, by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Mini-pirates. Despite their essential harmlessness, or possibility because of it, mini-pirates affect an extremely gruff and bloodthirsty manner. They like to deliver speeches, preferably about successful voyages of depredation and fat prizes. The uncharitable might accuse them of a penchant for bragging. Whenever two mini-pirates encounter each other, a frequent occurrence in a crowded ship, they simultaneously, with sweeping gestures and much shouting, list the merchant ships they claim to have sent to the bottom, and boast of innocent seamen mercilessly keyholed or made to walk the plank. While so doing, they drink rum, a beverage compounded of seaweed, juice and molasses, which, although it contains no alcohol whatever, simulates the imagination, and quickly slurs their speech. Mini-pirates have rather weak heads. I have often witnessed such encounters and listened to the mini-pirates' grandiose rodomontades. I must, however, admit to being influenced by their richly embroidered tales and extravagant flights of fancy. They taught me that a good white lie is often considerably more exciting than the truth. Telling one is like dressing up reality at its Sunday best. To a mini-pirate, nothing was worse than boredom. As soon as one of them grew even the slightest bit bored, he betrayed such agony of mind that it wrung your heart. He would sigh and groan and shake his hook at the sky, ruffle his hair and sometimes even tear his clothes. This only made matters worse, because he would then bemoan the rents in his outfit and accuse fate of heaping him with misfortune. Boredom, being a frequent guest aboard every ship at sea, the mini-pirates were forever moaning and groaning, and if they weren't moaning, they were bursting, and if they were neither moaning nor bursting, they were belting out pirate songs. Such was the atmosphere in which I grew up. I became the central feature of the mini-pirates' life. During the 5 years I spent with them, their activities revolved around me to the exclusion of almost everything else. It was as if I had at least lent some meaning to their ludicrous existence. They made touching efforts to teach me all they knew about buccaneering and the piratical way of life. They devoted entire days to singing me gruesome pirate songs, uttering oaths, hoisting the Jolly Roger, drawing maps that purported to show the location of buried treasure. Once they even tried, for my benefit, to capture a vessel at least 1,000 times bigger than their own. That was a day that taught me the meaning of abject failure. The seaman's trade, from raising anchor to caulking seams and bracing shrouds, I learnt simply by watching and lending a hand. I began by scrubbing the deck. It can be a real art to scrub a deck clean of every voracious bacterium, but not so smooth as to render it slippery underfoot, a particularly important consideration in the case of the mini-pirates, with their spindly peg legs. Soft soap with a small mixture of sand is the ideal substance for scouring decks, the soap for cleanliness, and the sand for grip. I learned how to sail close hold and how to line a lull, how to make the most of the following breeze, how to wear the ship, how to go about in a heavy sea, and how to stop dead, a trick mastered only by the mini-pirates, who used it to avoid dangerous collisions with sizable fish, in their case, anything bigger than a cod. Knots are one of the most important aspects of a seaman's life. I don't mean the speed of a ship, which is also measured in knots, but the many ways of tying a hempen rope. I learned 723 different methods of tying a knot, and I know them all by heart to this day. I can, of course, tie an ordinary reef knot, but also a mini-pirate's double skirtlet, a storm cravat, a goose gallows, a hobgoblin hitch, and even a double Gordian. I mastered the hempen twist and the 8-stranded octopus noose, the manila maze and the Rio rope yarn, the buccaneer's bowline and the captain's clinch. Blindfolded, I could tie 2 eels in a knot so complex that it would take them longer than a lifetime to disentangle themselves. Aboard the mini-pirate ship, I became something in the nature of a senior knotmaster. Whenever a knot was needed, they came to me. I could tie a knot in a fish. I could even, in a dire emergency, tie a knot in a knot. Navigation, of course, is especially important at sea. The mini-pirates had very few technical aids, were unfamiliar even with the magnetic compass. They steered in accordance with a system based on observation of the motion of the waves. People say that one wave resembles another, but they're mistaken. Watch waves for long enough and you'll realise that every one is different. Each wave undulates its own particular way. Some are pointed and precipitous, others are rounded and flat. Waves can be thick or thin, green or blue, black or brown, turbid or transparent, large or small, broad or long, cold or warm, salty or sweet, noisy or silent, fast or slow, and harmless or lethal. Every wave has a stature of its own, so to speak. It possesses not only a face of its own, but an individual hairstyle and the shape of the foam on its crest. Waves are differentiated by their mode of progression. Those in the southern waters favour a nonchalant, rolling gait. Those in the northern sea stride briskly along because of the cold and the danger of congealing into ice floes. Caribbean waves dance in calypso time, and Scottish waves form a line abreast and march along to the strains of inaudible bagpipes. Anyone who makes a detailed study of the subject will know which waves like to be where. Small green ones with funny little cowlicks of foam are found in shallow tropical waters. Dark and muddy ones near the coast, particularly in estuaries. Big blue ones in cold deep seas, and so forth. You can also tell precisely where you are from their appearance, whether you're sailing in shallow waters or above invisible sandbanks and coral reefs, whether you're near land or on the high seas, whether the current is treacherous, even whether the water contains sharks or merely herrings. If sharks are around, the waves develop a slight tremor. I also learned all I needed to know about the daily shipboard maintenance, how to repair planks, how to remove sea snails from the hull and cook them in a seaweed bouillon, how to keep my feet in a heavy sea, how to lower boats, throw lifebelts, stand my turn at masthead as a lookout. Within a year I was fully trained, able-bodied sea bear, and no longer threw up in rough weather. The mini pirates gave me plenty to eat, mainly seaweed and skinny little fish. They knew over 400 ways of preparing these dishes, which ranged from seaweed nature to a highly sophisticated soufflé, and I was privileged to sample every one of them. My present aversion to seaweed may possibly have stemmed from the mini pirates' dietary habits. Say what you like about seaweed, it contains all the important vitamins and proteins a little Bluebear needs in order to grow. Too many of them perhaps, because I grew at a speed that began to make me, and more particularly the mini pirates, uneasy. Having at first been smaller than my rescuers, I was the same size as them after a year. After the second year I was twice as big, and after 4 years my height was 5 times theirs. It can well be imagined that my rapid growth made a very unpleasant impression on sea rovers whose small stature endowed them with a natural mistrust of all things big. After 5 years on board I had become so large and heavy that I threatened to sink their ship. Although I failed to appreciate it at the time, the mini pirates did the only right thing by marooning me on an island one day. I'm sure they didn't find it easy. They gave me a bottle of seaweed juice and a loaf of home-made seaweed bread to see me on my way. Then moaning and groaning, they sailed off into the sunset. They knew that life without me would be considerably more tedious. As I sat there, naked and forlorn on the shores of a lonely island, I thought about my predicament for the first time. It was, in fact, the first time I'd ever really thought at all, because I'd never managed to form a clear idea about anything in the eternally noisy atmosphere of the mini pirate ship. I'm bound to admit that my first attempts at conjugation were far from unfathomably profound. The first thought that came to me in my head was of hunger, and the second of thirst, so I greedily wolfed down the seaweed bread and hurriedly drained my bottle of seaweed juice. My tummy was promptly pervaded by a pleasant glow, as if someone had lit a little campfire inside of me. Accompanying this sensation was a certain self-assurance that encouraged me to take the bull by the horns and explore the island's vast palm forest. This early experience may be said to become a maxim that has governed all my future lives. However great the challenge, it's easier to overcome with a decent meal inside me. Then came nightfall, and with it, darkness. Darkness. Until then I hadn't known what that was. It'd always been light with the mini pirates even at night. Their ship was brilliantly illuminated as soon as dusk closed in. Any mini pirate's vessel is a miniature sensation at night. It looks like a tiny, floating funfair, sound effects included, because mini pirates are terribly frightened of the dark. They believe that night is the time when hobgoblins come to feed on sailors' souls, and that those evil spirits can be kept at bay only by lavishly lighting the ship and encouraging the maximum possible output of noise. So my former shipmates not only illuminated their vessels with lanterns, flaming torches, strings of coloured fairy lights and small fires, but let off one signal rocket after another that created such a hellish din by singing, shouting and hammering on iron saucepans that no one could get a wink of sleep. Sleeping was done in the daytime, and as for hobgoblins, we were never troubled by them. So it was dark for the first time, and with the darkness came a novel sensation, one that had never afflicted me before: fear. It was a very unpleasant feeling, as if the darkness had infiltrated my body and were flowing through my veins. Having swayed so soothingly in the wind only minutes before, the lush green palm trees had now become black figures lurching towards me with their huge paws raised in menace. Floating in the sky was a thin crescent moon, the sight of which surprised me, because I had never noticed it in the permanent blaze of light on board ship. The wind rustled in the fronds of the palm trees and transformed them into a throng of whispering ghouls that hemmed me in, ever closer, and groped for me with their skeletal fingers. Despite myself, I suddenly thought of the hobgoblins. I strove to suppress the thought, but it was no good. I missed the mini pirates' hysterical hubbub, their raucous voices, and above all their extravagant lighting, the lighting that kept hobgoblins away. As I reached the absolute nadir of my young life, naked and alone, I was marooned in the midst of a dark and familiar forest and beside myself with fear. All at once, I sighted a very alarming phenomenon among the palm trees. Serpentine threads of green light, quite far off at first, but quickly drawing near. I also heard a nasty, high-pitched electric hum and an occasional hollow, mocking laugh of the kind uttered by the horned creatures that live down well shafts. This, so the mini-pirates had told me, was how hobgoblins advertised their presence. And an insert again from the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and Its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Hobgoblins. These beings fall into the category known as universally reviled life forms. See also the Spider Witch, the Troglotroll, and the Bolog. This includes those creatures resident in Zamonia and its environs whose deliberate policy is to spread panic amongst their contemporaries, and, in other respects, to indulge in antisocial, disruptive and killjoy behaviour of every description. Of repulsive or even terrifying appearance, hobgoblins usually operate in packs, making frightful noises and singing horrific songs. They delight in alarming utterly defenceless creatures. It was all too much for me. I felt the hot liquid well up inside my head. My eyes, my mouth and nose became filled with it, and my only recourse was to yield to this internal pressure. I wept. I wept for the first time in my life. Fat, salty tears plopped onto my fur and my nose ran like a tap. My whole body shook in time to my sobs. Everything else was secondary now. The encircling hobgoblins, the darkness, the fear, all were subordinate to this mighty outburst of emotion. I wept and sobbed, stamped my little hind paws, bawled at the top of my voice. Like 2 miniature cataracts, the tears continued to stream down my fur until I resembled a wet floor cloth. I broke down completely. Then calm descended. My tears dried up, my sobs subsided. A reassuring sensation of warmth and weariness overcame me. My fear had vanished. I even plucked up enough courage to raise my head and look at the hobgoblins in the face. They were hovering around me in a semicircle, 6 or 7 flickering outlined in the ghostly light, their arms and legs dangling limply like inflated inner tubes. They stared at me in silence for a while, almost touch. Then they started to applaud. I won't mince my words. The hobgoblins were a thoroughly unpleasant bunch. Their slithery movements, the slight electric shock you received when they touched you, the high-pitched sing-song voices, and above all, the dubious pleasure they derived from terrorising helpless fellow creatures. All these attributes were utterly repulsive. There was also the smell of rotting wood they gave off. It was associated with their sleeping habits, and more particularly their disgusting form of nourishment, but more of that later. Yes, the hobgoblins really were the end, but I went with them notwithstanding. After all, what choice did I have? I didn't understand a word they said or sang, whichever, but I quickly gathered that they wanted me to accompany them. In view of my predicament, I felt it was the wisest policy, though heaven alone knew what they would do to me. They glided ahead through the forest, gracefully flowing around every obstacle like water snakes composed of green light. If their path was barred by something too big or solid, a boulder for example, or a fallen mammoth tree, they simply slipped straight through it as if it was no more substantial than mist. I found it quite difficult to keep up with them, but they politely paused every now and again and waited for me to catch up. They spent these intervals singing some rather awful songs. The tunes themselves sounded so sinister, I was glad I couldn't understand the words. I was utterly exhausted, my fur full of leaves, thorns and little twigs when we finally reached our destination, a large clearing in the middle of the forest. Rotting away in this clearing were the hollow trunks of hundreds of huge trees inhabited by hundreds or possibly thousands of hobgoblins. For the time being, this graveyard for forest giants was to be my home. And that's the end of the first chapter, the 13.5 Lives of Captain Bluebear, covering his very first life with the mini pirates. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe and watch any of the other videos that are up. If you have any requests, please leave them in the comments.